A decorated black Marine showed up at his son's graduation and was asked to leave by security. What happened next? 6 Navy SEALs stood up, and what they did silenced the entire room. This isn't just a story about injustice. It's about honor, redemption, and a father's pride. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, amber glow across the campus of Brookridge High. The auditorium lights flickered on one by one as proud families filed in. Mothers in bright dresses, fathers in crisp shirts, and little siblings bouncing in their seats, all eager to witness a milestone. Graduation day. Inside the hall, the air buzzed with excitement. Students in black gowns and gold sashes peeked through side curtains, whispering and giggling nervously. Teachers shuffled papers and straightened microphones. Parents wiped their eyes before the ceremony even began, overwhelmed with pride. In the middle of this joyous chaos, one man sat alone, calm, quiet, and observant. He was tall, easily over 6 feet. His frame was strong, almost military in posture, even though he wore no uniform. His skin was deep brown, his face clean-shaven, but marked with small scars that told their own stories. He wore a simple navy blue suit, freshly pressed. A gleaming pin sat on his lapel, a purple heart. His name was Sergeant Marcus Jennings, though no one in that auditorium knew it yet. He hadn't come for attention. He hadn't come to be noticed or applauded. He came for one reason, and one reason only: to see his son, Tyrell Jennings, graduate, not just as a student, but as the valedictorian of his class. Tyrell was everything Marcus had worked for, everything he had fought for. After 22 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, through the blistering deserts of Iraq, the muddy mountains of Afghanistan, and back to the loneliness of home, Marcus had missed more birthdays and milestones than he could count. But tonight, he wouldn't miss a thing. He arrived early, before the doors even opened, just to make sure he got a good seat. Row 7, center. He sat tall, hands folded in his lap, scanning the stage where his son would soon make him proud. But, despite his quiet pride and calm demeanor, something began to stir. Parents in the rows ahead turned and looked at him. Some glanced twice, a few whispered. One woman frowned, then leaned into her husband, pointing discreetly. The murmurs didn't escape Marcus. He noticed. He always did. The battlefield taught him that silence often meant something was coming. He tried to ignore it. After all, what could possibly go wrong? He had his ticket. He was dressed properly. He wasn't bothering anyone. This moment was about his son, not him. But then he saw it. Movement near the entrance. 2 uniformed security guards entered the room. They weren't school staff. These were private security, bulky, serious-looking men with earpieces and folded arms. One of them pointed into the crowd. Marcus instinctively turned to see who they were looking at. That's when he realized it was him. The guards began making their way down the aisle, parting families as they went. The chatter died down. Heads turned. A subtle tension filled the room. Marcus sat still, confused but composed, watching them approach. When they finally reached his row, one of the guards leaned down and said, "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." Marcus blinked. "Why?" "There's been a complaint," the other guard added, keeping his voice low. "Someone said you looked suspicious. You weren't on the parent list." Marcus looked around slowly. People were watching, whispering. His voice was calm. "I'm here for my son's graduation. His name is Tyrell Jennings." The guard didn't flinch. "I understand. But we need to ask you to step outside, just for a minute." There it was, that feeling. The one Marcus had grown far too used to. Not the danger of war zones, but the quiet hostility of being treated like he didn't belong, like he was a problem, not a parent. His heart didn't race. He was trained better than that. But deep inside, a part of him stung. Not for himself, but for Tyrell. This was supposed to be his moment. What would happen if his son walked on stage and didn't see his father in the crowd? Still, Marcus rose slowly. He wasn't about to make a scene. As he stood, a few gasps escaped from nearby rows. One man murmured, "I thought he was just someone off the street." A woman clutched her purse tighter. They didn't know. They didn't know this man had led troops through ambushes and IEDs. They didn't know he had taken shrapnel in his back to protect his squad. They didn't know he had been awarded for valor twice. They didn't know that while their kids were studying in safe classrooms, he had been sleeping in tents under foreign skies, writing letters to a son he barely got to see. They saw a black man sitting alone. That's all it took. And now, he was being asked to leave, quietly, without explanation, like a shadow in the night. But what no one expected, not the guards, not the parents, not even Marcus himself, was that the next few moments would change everything. Because in that very room were men who did know him, men whose lives he had saved, and they were about to stand up. The rustle of graduation programs and quiet chatter filled the auditorium, but all of it seemed to fade as two private security guards entered the room, moving. With quiet urgency. They weren't part of the school staff. These men were dressed in black tactical gear, with walkie-talkies clipped to their belts and earpieces tucked into their collars. Their presence alone caused a ripple of unease through the rows of seated families. The first guard scanned the crowd, his eyes sharp and searching. Then he paused, nudging his partner. "There," he said, pointing. "Row 7, middle seat." They began weaving through the rows of chairs, brushing past stunned parents who parted like water to let them through. Whispered voices rose around them. A few parents leaned into each other. Who are they going for? What's going on? Did something happen? And then they stopped, right in front of Marcus Jennings. The taller guard leaned in, expression blank and professional, and said something that made time freeze. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us." Marcus looked up slowly, eyebrows raised. "Is there a problem?" The second guard, who was shorter but more aggressive, in tone added, "There's been a complaint. Some of the parents said you looked suspicious." That word, suspicious, landed like a slap. Marcus tilted his head, confused but calm. "Suspicious? I'm here for my son's graduation. Tyrell Jennings, valedictorian." But the guards didn't seem interested in details. They didn't ask for his name. They didn't ask for ID. They didn't even look at the neatly printed ticket in his hand. As far as they were concerned, his very presence was enough to warrant removal. Marcus had experienced moments like this before. Subtle glances, locked car doors at red lights, a cashier watching him more closely than others. But this, being told to leave his son's graduation, stung differently. This was Tyrell's day. The moment they had both worked so hard for. The boy who studied late into the night while Marcus was deployed. The boy who looked up to his father as a real-life superhero. And now that father was being told, in front of everyone, that he didn't belong. Marcus slowly stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. A lifetime of discipline, forged in desert heat and battlefield chaos, taught him that control was power. Around him, heads began to turn. A few parents nearby stared openly. Others awkwardly looked away. A woman in a pearl necklace pulled her child closer. An older man muttered under his breath, "Why didn't they just check him at the door?" Still, no one said anything aloud. "No," one asked, "what did he actually do?" No one asked, "Is this a mistake?" No one stood up. As Marcus stepped into the narrow aisle between seats, he became a spotlight. Not for celebration, but for suspicion. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't resisting, but somehow, just his presence had triggered fear. And it wasn't the first time. Marcus glanced down at the small pin on his suit jacket, a Purple Heart, awarded for injuries he'd received protecting his unit from a roadside bomb in Helmand Province. He had nearly died that day, but instead of recognition, all anyone seemed to see now was a tall black man in a suit they didn't understand. The first guard motioned for him to follow. Marcus sighed silently and nodded. And that would have been a quiet humiliation. A father escorted out of the room where he was supposed to cheer on his son, a memory stained forever. But then, a single voice rang out, firm, clear, and unmistakably authoritative. "Is there a reason you're removing Sergeant Marcus Jennings from this ceremony?" The room fell silent. Every head turned toward the back of the auditorium, where a row of men in crisp uniforms had stood up as one. 6 men, 6 soldiers, Navy SEALs. Their presence was electric. Even without medals on their chests or guns in their hands, these men exuded power, respect, and absolute confidence. People stopped breathing for a moment, sensing something important was unfolding. One of them, a bearded SEAL with piercing eyes, stepped forward. "I served with that man," he said, pointing to Marcus. "He saved my life in Fallujah." The guards froze. Everything about their body language changed in an instant. Another SEAL took a step forward. "And mine in Kandahar." A third spoke up. "He's not suspicious. He's a hero." The guards now looked visibly uncomfortable. What had started as a quiet removal had exploded into a full-blown reckoning in front of the entire graduating class and their families. The taller guard cleared his throat. "We were just following protocol. Someone reported a concern, the SEAL who first spoke narrowed his eyes. "Concern? For what? Sitting quietly and supporting his son? You didn't even ask his name." The room remained deathly quiet. Even the principal had paused backstage, watching the confrontation unfold. With wide eyes, one of the SEALs stepped forward and stood beside Marcus. "If he leaves," he said plainly, "we all leave." Then another followed, and another, until all 6 stood in a line, shoulder to shoulder with the man they called brother. "Is there a reason you're removing Sergeant Jennings from this room?" The question cut through the silence like a blade. Heads turned in unison toward the back of the auditorium, where 6 figures in uniform were now standing. They weren't part of the faculty. They weren't parents. They were unmistakably different, their posture rigid, their gazes locked forward. These were Navy SEALs, and in that moment, their presence became impossible to ignore. The audience seemed to forget where they were. The graduation ceremony paused, not by official announcement, but by the sheer gravity of what was unfolding. The lead SEAL, tall and square-jawed with deep scars along his neck, took a slow, deliberate step forward. His voice carried, not loud, but solid and steady, like a man used to being heard. "That man saved my life in Fallujah," he said, pointing directly at Marcus Jennings, "and 4 of ours in Kandahar." The silence that followed was thunderous. The 2 security guards froze, their posture stiffening. They didn't need to ask who he was talking about. Marcus Jennings, the man they were trying to escort out moments earlier, was now standing at the center of attention, surrounded not by suspicion, but by 6 of the most elite warriors in the military. A ripple went through the crowd. People began whispering, "Is that really him? He was in the Marines? Fallujah? Kandahar? No way." Suddenly, the same parents who looked at Marcus with doubt were now watching him in awe. The man they had seen as a stranger now stood taller in their eyes, not because he changed, but because the truth had finally walked into the room. Another SEAL stepped forward, this one clean-shaven with eyes like steel. "You should be shaking his hand," he said firmly, "not throwing him out." The guards, now visibly uncomfortable, exchanged a glance. The lead one fumbled with his radio, as if hoping to call for backup. But what kind of backup do you call when the people challenging you are Navy SEALs? He tried to salvage the moment. "We were just responding to a complaint," he said awkwardly. "It's standard protocol." A few parents thought he looked out of place. The third SEAL, broad-shouldered and quiet until now, stepped forward with an intensity that turned every head. "Out of place?" he echoed, voice low but full of meaning. "You mean, like a hero among people who don't recognize one?" Nobody had an answer. The guard said nothing. Marcus stood still, his expression unreadable. He hadn't asked for this. He wasn't the one making speeches. He didn't point to his medals. He didn't shout or argue. But now others were speaking for him, because they knew what he had sacrificed. Another SEAL, this one younger with sandy hair, turned to face the crowd. "This man," he said, motioning to Marcus, "is the reason 5 of us came home alive. You call that suspicious?" He looked toward the principal, who had just stepped onto the stage, clearly unsure of what to say. "You all talk about honoring achievement tonight, valedictorians, scholarships, excellence. Well, let me tell you, there's no greater example of excellence in this room than the man you just tried to humiliate." The room was still. Even the children sensed something significant was happening. Phones came out, recording. Eyes welled with quiet emotion. And then it happened. One of the SEALs, the oldest one, with gray creeping into his beard, turned to the guards and said simply, "Let's make this easy. Either he stays, or none of us do." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. One by one, the SEALs turned their backs to the guards and moved to surround Marcus. Not in a protective circle, but a formation of respect. Each stood straight, arms folded behind their backs, eyes forward. Like a silent tribute. Then, as if on cue, something incredible happened. An older man from the audience, a grandfather by the looks of him, slowly stood up. He raised his hand toward Marcus. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," he said, voice trembling with emotion. Then another stood, and another. Within seconds, rows of parents were on their feet, applauding. Some clapped, others cheered. A few simply nodded, their faces filled with regret for how they had judged him too quickly. Even the principal stepped down from the stage and walked up to Marcus. "On behalf of the school," she said softly, "I sincerely apologize." Marcus didn't speak right away. He looked around the room, not angry, but humbled, even a bit surprised. Finally, he said quietly, "I didn't come here to be recognized. I just wanted to see my boy graduate." And from the back of the auditorium came a shout from one of the SEALs. "Well, now you're going to see it, front and center." The guards, with nothing left to say, quietly backed away and disappeared. Out a side door. Marcus took his seat again, but not alone this time. The SEALs sat beside him. No longer was he just another face in the crowd. He was now the most respected man in the room. One by one, the Navy SEALs took their seats, not scattered across the auditorium, but right beside Sergeant Marcus Jennings. Their silent gesture sent a message louder than words. This man belongs here, and he's not alone. The 2 private security guards, red-faced and humiliated, slowly backed off. No more orders, no more accusations. Just an awkward shuffle toward the exit as every eye in the auditorium, now focused on the man they had, tried to remove. Marcus remained calm, composed. But inside, emotion stirred. He wasn't one to seek attention. In fact, he'd spent his entire life deflecting it, putting mission before ego. But this moment, this wasn't about him anymore. This was about something far greater. As the room settled, the principal stepped to the microphone. He had been standing just off stage during the entire confrontation, eyes wide as the drama unfolded in front of him. But now, with the mic in hand, his voice cracked slightly as he addressed the crowd. "I'd like to take a moment before we begin," he said, clearing his throat. The room quieted again. "There's a man in this audience who deserves far more than just a seat tonight," the principal continued. Not only is his son the valedictorian of our graduating class, but this father is a decorated veteran, a man who has given more to this country than most of us ever will. He turned, slightly, and gestured toward the middle row. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in honoring Sergeant Marcus Jennings. For half a second, there was silence. That stunned pause when something truly powerful lands in a room. Then, the auditorium erupted. Applause thundered from every corner. People shot to their feet. Students who had barely glanced at Marcus before were now clapping with wide, emotional eyes. Parents wiped away tears as they applauded. The same crowd that had earlier doubted his presence now stood in unified recognition, not just of his service, but of their own blind assumptions. Some clapped slowly and respectfully, others cheered loudly. A few veterans in the audience saluted. Even the 2 security guards now lingering at the edge of the crowd joined in, though they could barely meet anyone's gaze. And Marcus? He didn't ask for this. He didn't come dressed in his dress blues or bring photos of his deployments. He wore a simple suit, his Purple Heart pin the only clue to his sacrifices. He hadn't spoken up when accused. He hadn't pointed fingers. He just stood with quiet dignity. But now, as the auditorium roared with applause, he stood. Not for recognition, not for applause, but for his son. Marcus rose from his chair and nodded humbly. He didn't wave. He didn't smile broadly. He simply placed a hand over his heart, then turned to look up at the stage, where a young man in a cap and gown waited, eyes locked on him. Tyrell Jennings, valedictorian, scholar, role model. And above all, a son raised by a warrior. Tyrell's eyes glistened as he watched his father stand. The entire school had seen what had just happened. Everyone had witnessed the disrespect and the redemption. But for Tyrell, it was something even more personal. His father had missed birthdays, missed games, missed milestones, not because he didn't care, but because he was halfway around the world keeping others safe. And tonight, just tonight, Marcus had finally made it. This graduation was supposed to be the moment they shared, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it had almost been stolen. As the applause died down, Tyrell stepped to the podium. The principal motioned for him to begin his valedictorian speech, but Tyrell didn't open his folder. He took a deep breath and looked out, across the crowd. "Before I begin," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I want to talk about someone who means the world to me." The audience quieted instantly. A lot of people know me as a good student, the kid who stayed up late studying, the one who got straight A's. But the truth is, I only learned discipline and focus because of one man. He turned and looked directly at his father. My dad. A few gasps, a few tears. Phones were up now, capturing every word. When I was little, I didn't understand why he had to leave so often. I didn't get why he missed Christmas or my birthday. But as I grew older, I started to realize he wasn't gone because he didn't care. He was gone because he did. Tyrell paused. A single tear slipped down his cheek. He's a Marine. A man who's risked his life more times than I can count. And tonight, someone tried to take away his seat. But what they didn't realize is he's earned every seat in this room, because without him, I wouldn't be here. The room fell completely still. Even the fidgety students in the back row were hanging on every word. Tyrell glanced again at Marcus, who now sat motionless, holding back emotion as best he could. "So," Tyrell said, voice breaking slightly, "before I give my speech about dreams and futures and all the things we're supposed to say at graduations, I just want to say, Dad, thank you for everything. This diploma is yours just as much as it is mine." The audience erupted again, louder than before. Not just applause this time, but standing ovations, cheers, even some sobs from proud parents, who couldn't hold back their emotion. Marcus, normally so stoic, allowed himself a small smile. He nodded once to his son, a moment of silent understanding that said everything no words ever could. This wasn't just a graduation anymore. It was a celebration of character. When Tyrell Jennings took the stage that night, he wasn't just stepping up as the valedictorian. He was stepping up as a young man who had just watched his father, a war hero, be dismissed, then honored in front of hundreds. The auditorium had quieted. The earlier incident still lingered in the air, like electricity. Everyone, parents, students, teachers, leaned forward in their seats, unsure of what Tyrell would say. His prepared speech sat folded in his hand, but he made no move to open it. Instead, he looked out over the crowd, then directly at his father. "I plan to talk about hard work and dreams tonight," Tyrell began, voice steady but emotional. "About ambition and grades and going off to college. But something more important just happened." The audience held its breath. He took a step closer to the microphone. "That man," Tyrell said, pointing clearly and proudly at his father, "was told he didn't belong here tonight." People turned to look again at Sergeant Marcus Jennings, still seated beside the 6 Navy SEALs who had taken it upon themselves to defend his dignity. Tyrell continued. "Some people saw a black man sitting alone and assumed the worst. No questions, no conversations, just judgment." You could hear the rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats, the discomfort visible now, not from Tyrell's words but from their own silence earlier. "And the thing is," Tyrell said, his voice dropping a little, "that's not the first time something like this has happened to him. And it's not the first time it's happened to me either." He paused, then said something that hit the crowd like a thunderclap. "I've spent my whole life being told I didn't belong in honors classes, that I didn't look like someone who should lead the debate team, that I got lucky when I got into college." There were gasps. A few heads dropped. "But the truth is," he said, louder now, "he's the reason I stand here today." He motioned toward his father again. "Because every time someone told me I didn't belong, I remembered who raised me, a man who wore the uniform for 22 years, who risked his life more times than I can count, who came home with scars on his body and still got up every day to teach me how to be strong." Tyrell looked around the room now, not angry, but resolute. "So, if there's anyone in this room who doesn't know his name, let me help you." He turned, voice clear, firm, and full of pride. "His name is Sergeant Marcus Jennings, and you better remember it now." And then, it happened again. First, the Navy SEALs stood, not one by one, but together, rising in perfect unison. Then, the audience followed. No hesitation this time, no second guessing. The entire auditorium stood. They clapped. They shouted. They cheered louder than they had for any diploma, any speech, any student that night. This wasn't just applause. This was a reckoning. A silent wrong had been made right. Not behind closed doors, not after the ceremony, but in front of everyone, where it mattered most. In the same place the insult occurred, the honor had returned tenfold. Some students cried, some parents held each other. Even a few teachers, many of whom had taught Tyrell for years, wiped their eyes with tissues. Marcus Jennings didn't move at first. He just sat, a quiet man in a storm of noise, overcome not by pride or ego, but by love. Slowly he stood again, placing one hand over his heart. Then he gave his son the smallest of nods. It was all the approval Tyrell needed. And the SEALs, they stood beside him not as heroes, not as soldiers, but as witnesses. Witnesses to a brother who had saved them. And now they had returned the favor, not in battle, but in a high school auditorium, with nothing more than the truth and their presence. Later that night, after the ceremony had ended and the crowds had filtered out, Marcus and Tyrell stood together on the empty stage. The decorations were coming down, the lights were dimming, but in that quiet space, a different kind of spotlight shined. "You didn't have to say all that," Marcus said softly, looking down at his son. Tyrell smiled. I did. Marcus looked at him, really looked at him, and nodded. I've faced a lot of things in my life, but tonight, that was something else. Tyrell's voice was quiet. You faced it with more grace than I ever could. And then, without ceremony, they embraced. Not as a Marine and a student, not as a father and son, but as two men linked forever by truth, resilience, and unshakable love. In the end, Sergeant Jennings didn't leave his son's graduation. He became the heart of it. Because sometimes, in the most unexpected places, a moment of injustice becomes a moment of transformation. Thanks to 6 Navy SEALs, a courageous son, and a silent room that chose to listen, one man's dignity was not just restored, it was celebrated, and no one who witnessed it that night would ever forget his name again. Respect isn't about how you look. It's about what you've done. What would you have done if you were in that room? Let us know in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe for more true and powerful stories.